new community and to tie them to this new community that was out in Lerner Limited Deal, or whatever, I can't remember the name of the company. But it was really designed to help connect those two parts of the Columbus community together. And I thought that was really something very, very unique and special. So when you look at transit-oriented development, recognize that in the classic old sense, you're looking for high density. Okay? So you're looking for probably more apartments than you are single family. If you have single family, you're probably looking for more townhomes than you are single family detached. And I got to tell you, in North Carolina, it almost becomes a anathema. And yet, if you look around at a lot of communities, they are really starting to get the message. They're starting to get the message that everybody cannot live in a single-family detached home. Everybody, frankly, doesn't need to live in a single-family detached home. And the reality is that if we do this kind of density building, what we're going to be able to do in towns like, quite frankly, Wilmington, is have an advantage. You also, over time, you're able to house a population a little closer to where you're trying to do all these wonderful natural beauty, cultural, blah, blah, blah things, instead of everybody saying, if I'm going to build single-family housing for 1,000 people, I got to get a patch of land down off of 17, 4 miles away from anything else, because that's where the land's going to be cheap enough to buy it, okay? Miles away from the river, miles away from the water, miles away from everything else, and then everybody can get in their car and drive down any of the cultural things we have and what we did they want to go to. Wrong-headed thinking. I was telling somebody, I came down here to work for a statewide community development financial institution, run that, and in doing that, I came down here, quite frankly, Wilmington, the one worked with your CFEDC down here, and they took me to a location that they had actually helped them acquire after Floyd. And it was designed to be affordable housing for folks who had lost their houses at Floyd. And I got to tell you, I'm not from here, I'm not from, frankly, mainly not in the rural area. But they had these guys so far out of town, back in the wilderness, that I just sat there and said, I mean, why would you do that to anybody? If you said, folks, I'm going to house are having the hardest time putting nickels and dimes together, why would I take them as far away from jobs, transportation, cultural events, as these guys look? You know why? Because they could afford the land out there. So we got to think a little smarter. Transit-oriented development, to conclude, is really about understanding that transportation, as they said in this study from the Miller Center up at UVA, looked at very hard because they said, really, transportation is the backbone of what makes America work. Really, it has provided us with a lot of what we have today because we have a good transportation system, mainly highway. But we have a good transportation system. It gets people around. We have mobility. But the reality of the situation is, if we don't start thinking smarter, we're going to be dooming ourselves. And I'll make my last statement. We all thought, whew, when gas got back down to $2.12, $2.25, crisis is over. We're in good shape. I can live with that. I was telling somebody, I mean, I drive a big Escalade. My wife said, we went out to get a car. No, I don't trust you on the road with a little bitty car. You got to get yourself a big car. So I got a big car. I am hating that right now like nobody's business. Okay? I mean, the reality is, we've got to recognize that the gas situation that we're facing, the energy situation that we're facing, is in our lifetime not going to get better. We may have periodic things that go on that make it feel better, but the reality is we're talking about a finite resource that is not going to get better. And I don't care if we go to electricity or electric cars. It's not going to get better. We're going to have to figure out how we indeed design our living around a better form of transportation. We're going to have to get individuals out of their individual cars. We're going to have to put fewer of those cars on the road. We're going to have to think about this in a real hard way. And I said lastly, any of you who are in this room who are not necessarily tied to transportation as it were, you may be tied to housing, you may be tied to education. You need to put transportation in the middle of your thinking. So when you have a conversation about where you're going to build the next school, it's not just about that's the cheapest land. but it is how we're going to get kids to and from it. How the parents are going to get to and from it. How does it fit into the overall community? And how hard is it going to be for folks to have the benefit of the educational system we're trying to put out here when we haven't figured out how we're going to transport them? So I just would suggest to you that transit-oriented development is about all of that. And it really is about figuring out how to get yourself oriented around the transportation systems that you have in order to make it easier for you to have a better and more viable community, which is what I heard today. So thank you for the opportunity to come and speak.
Can I add one more thing? But I think it's especially with one of the things that I did around the country actually with the American Public Transit Association was to help people look and frame the framework, how to do transit better. And it's surrounded, like in Sacramento, the state did not build any facilities unless they were on a rail or a bus line. There were limitations that were put in place. One of the other key points that I think would benefit this area in the state is the idea of where are you going to get the resources that makes you have a transit-oriented development area. And thinking outside of that box. And one of the things is that if the rules in FTA were changed, I think probably like 10, 15 years ago, that allows you, for example, if this building was bought by a transit agency for future development, and maybe all you're going to have is a bus stop out in front, but the revenue that you make off of the rental of the space, you could use if you chose to even sell it. I mean, you had those options weren't available to you prior to that provision being changed in, I think, ICE-T, or I think it was ICE-T. So there are, I don't want to leave without I don't want to separate the policy that drives your ability to have. And I think you get to have this picture of I was like a livable community guru when Gordon Linton was the transit administrator, because I thought it would be such a I lived downtown Chicago, and to walk out, to have somewhere to eat, I walked to work, if I wanted to take the bus, it was there. It was just like living in a little bubble. But you had neighbors, you had green space, but you had an integrated approach to moving around. But again, that came from a plan, that came from a design, and I think it's possible in grids where there's already development. I mean, there's creative ways in which you can modify structures, and he mentioned Columbus so much, but that partnership wasn't driven by the transit system. It was driven by the Levi brothers. And in other areas, like in Colorado, Denver, they wanted their light rail to work, but they had to get through these communities and get the support. And I think that drove the ability for them to finally have the success that they did. In North Carolina, we don't have a particular public transportation advocate or champion because everything is so focused on highways. And I think when you get back to the policy that's driven, I remember in Illinois at the time where people really did fight for the seat on the board for the planning process. There was not a public entity that was written into another ICE-T bill that required that. So the provisions that now allow this voice to come to the table that you make these policy changes are really, really critical and available to everybody that's sitting here today.
Well, thanks. And I'm going to take my